Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are. The issue of Zimbabwean election, the legitimacy of the last month's election, has taken another turn. President Cyril Ramaphosa is in New York, like many other leaders. He's attending the UN General Assembly, where the leaders take it in turn to go on the stage and say their piece. And some of the leaders will be addressing empty chairs, but that is another matter. While he's there, President Cyril Ramaphosa was interviewed by South African Broadcasting Corporation, and he is now giving a totally different tone to the Zimbabwean election. He has acknowledged that Sadak will meet to discuss the Sadak election observer mission report. But most significantly, he is now reducing or watering down that report to the point where the serious issues raised in that report, he is reducing them to mere challenges. Let's listen to what he has to say.
As South Africa does every year in a General Assembly speech for the lifting of sanctions in Cuba, which is not in Africa, to be clear, but also in Zimbabwe. I'll tell you what the US president wrote to Congress when they renewed the sanctions regime earlier this year. President Mnangagwa has not made necessary political and economic reforms that would warrant terminating the existing targeted sanctions program, citing continued repression and intimidation of citizens, absence of reforms on rule of law, democratic governance, and protection of human rights. They are also pointing to the SADC observer missions report that pointed to issues of credibility and process in terms of the election. Yet you, Mr. President, were at the inauguration, you congratulated President Mnangagwa. How do you thread that needle given what SADC has said and what the United States is saying?
Well, let's get it right. What was said by a representative of the observer mission is still got to be discussed in SADC because it's not a final report. And if one looks at that report, it actually says there were challenges with regard to a number of things that have to do with elections. And many countries around the world have such challenges. The United States is, a prime example with regard to their last election. So there are challenges, and they have said in the report, as I read it, that certain things need to be improved. They have not declared the election as invalid, unfree, and unfair. They have highlighted certain challenges.
Problems with transparency, independence, fairness, and credibility of all stages of the electoral process. That's what the report says.
Well, that indeed, and those are challenges that need to be addressed. What was
challenges that would be unacceptable in the South African context?
Well, where there's a lack of transparency, they need to come up with the details. And I would say, yes, let the details be put forward so that we can deal with them. So we are waiting to receive that report at the SADC level so that we can deal with it. Because if anything, it was an interim report. So once the report is put to the SADC body, we will then debate it, and we will also hear representations from Zimbabwe, as well as from the observer mission as well.
Let's be clear what he's saying here. The report was very clear that the election process in Zimbabwe failed to meet Zimbabwe's own legal requirements. These are serious issues. You cannot compare them to some of the issues that arose in America, for instance, in other countries. These are at the heart of elections. For instance, Zimbabwe, ZEC failed to produce a verified voters' roll. This is not just in one ward or one constituency. Nationwide, we are talking of institutionalized irregularities and flaws here. And yet here somebody who wants to pretend that these are challenges that could be need to be rectified. And we know where this is going. South Africa has said that it did not want regime change in Zimbabwe. It said it last year. How another country could make such an outrageous statement beggars belief. Surely South Africa, it's not for South Africa to say there should be regime change in Zimbabwe or not. And yet here we are. That was exactly what they meant. What has happened in the past is that Zimbabwe, Zanu PF has rigged elections, and the election observers from Sadak and the AU have turned a blind eye to that. They've turned around and said, well, the elections were substantially free, fair, and credible. Yes, there were some irregularities, but still they were substantially free, fair, and credible. And that's granting Zanu PF legitimacy. That is exactly what Sadak, at least South Africa, was hoping would happen this time round. It did not. Sadak election observers said those elections were so flawed, they failed to meet Zimbabwe's own basic laws in terms of elections. When you cannot produce a verified voters' roll, when you have got reports, not just an isolated report or a few isolated reports, but this is systematic, where the electorate are frog marched to go and vote, to attend rallies and then go and vote. Those are institutionalized, countrywide flaws and irregularities. To try to reduce them to mere challenges is an insult. I think South Africa here has got a lot to explain. South Africa, like I've said before, is in a serious economic situation. Nearly 30 years of ANC rule have reduced that country's once really prosperous economy into a collapsed economy. It is no secret that unemployment in South Africa is soared, crime is soared, corruption, mismanagement. Those are the realities that South Africa is facing. ANC is desperate to hang on to power. And what ANC is well aware of is that if there was to be regime change in Zimbabwe, given all the mess that Zanu PF has made all these years, the economy in Zimbabwe, let's be honest, has collapsed, completely collapsed. Zimbabwe is a failed state. South Africa is in the process of becoming another failed African state. It hasn't got there yet. Some people will argue on that. The jury is out, still out on that one. But nonetheless, what we can say with confidence is that South Africa's economy is in serious trouble. If there was to be regime change in Zimbabwe, or even a government of national unity, as happened in 2008 to 2013, the economy did improve. The first year of the GNU, the economy registered a 12% economic recovery, as compared to minus 6% the previous year. Of course, South Africans would see that as, wow, okay, if Zimbabwe had regime change and their economy improved, maybe we can have the same here. And that is what is frightening the daylights out of ANC government. They do not want a precedent where a failed state is seen to have recovered when they have removed the incumbent government. Because they know, particularly in South Africa, where elections are free, fair, and credible, they will know that South Africa's ANC government, the ruling government right now that has ruled South Africa for the last 30 years, will probably lose power next year. And their own campaign they will be on a back footing straight away. They know could one of the biggest argument the opposition in South Africa will be saying is, look what has happened in Zimbabwe. They managed to bite the bullet and say, okay, we've got to have regime change. And they changed the regime. And look, the economy has improved. We can have the same here in South Africa. What will ANC say? They have nothing to say on that one. And so stopping regime change in Zimbabwe has become the #1 priority for ANC. ANC's re-election will be zero if there was regime change in Zimbabwe. And when you are facing that kind of prospect, what do? You'll go bend over backwards to make sure that there is no regime change. I think what we are going to see here is South Africa pulling all the stops. This is the opening. President Ramaphosa is now saying those elections in Zimbabwe, yes, they were not free, fair, and credible. They had challenges, but so do many other countries, including America itself. What kind of challenges are we talking about here? These are institutionalized challenges where you fail to produce a verified voters' roll. They want to declare Zanu PF legitimate, although there was no verified voters' roll. Who voted for Zanu PF? He doesn't know. Nobody knows, because there was no verified voters' roll. Why did the country fail to produce something as basic as a verified voters' roll? The European Union has just withdrawn its funding of ZEC. They've been funding ZEC to the tune of 5 million. And they've decided, no, they are going to cancel that funding. You have got 5 million, and you cannot even produce a verified voters' roll. There can only be one reason for it. You don't want a voters' roll. You don't want anybody to audit who voted. This is at the heart of our problem. South Africa has argued, and this point must be made, that the elections in Zimbabwe are not free, fair, and credible. And this is why the journalists opened these remarks by talking of how President Ramaphosa, in his address at the UN, condemned sanctions against Cuba and also condemned sanctions against Zimbabwe. Fair enough. Are we saying here that because of sanctions, Zimbabweans should be denied their fundamental right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country? And by the way, he has conveniently ignored the fact that Zanu PF has been rigging elections since the country's independence in 1980. So this issue of Zanu PF rigging elections because they are under pressure from sanctions is completely ridiculous. Zanu PF has been rigging elections ever since the country's independence. After signing the Lancaster House agreement, Zanu PF went back to Zimbabwe. This is the first election to launch the independence Zimbabwe. Zanu PF was supposed to withdraw all its operatives into assembly points. It did not. It kept some of its operatives in the field, not just to campaign, but to tell the people that if Zanu PF does not win the election, the Bush war would continue. That says it all. How can those elections be free, fair, and credible when you're under threat? Of course, the people voted to end the Bush war. And when Zanu PF got into power, it's so to consolidate its power, its hold on power. The Gura massacre of 1983 to 1987 was purely a politically motivated massacre. Zanu PF wanted to eliminate its main competitor, PF SAPU. And the Gura was meant to force PF SAPU to give up its political ambition and join Zanu PF, which they ultimately did, culminating with the signing of the 1987 Unit Accord. Zimbabwe has never held free, fair, and credible elections. To now pretend it's not holding free, fair, and credible elections because there are sanctions is just nonsense. I think South Africa is planning to water down the Sadak and the AU reports to justify granting Zanu PF political legitimacy. That is at the heart of ANC's plan. What is interesting for Zimbabweans out there, and what people should realize, is that ANC is bending over backwards to make sure that Zanu PF is given political legitimacy and they stay in power, purely for the sake of ANC survival in power. And once Zanu PF has been installed back in Harare, I can tell you that this ANC government is going to introduce laws, or at least turn a blind eye to some of the vigilante activities directed at foreigners. South Africans have tend to blaming foreigners for their own economic hardships. They are the easy target, they are the easy scapegoat. But that is going to increase even more, particularly now that it is in ANC's own prominent advantage to be seen to be tough on these foreigners for the sake of winning power. So those Zimbabweans will find themselves in a situation where, with Zanu PF back in office, the economic prospects are going to disappear. And so they will find themselves in a situation where even more would want to leave the country. And at the present moment, South Africa has been the destination for many of them. They will find that leaving Zimbabwe to go to South Africa is hell. Because the ANC government will see to it that they are not welcome there. So we are finding ourselves in a situation where ANC is bending over backwards to keep a regime that the people of Zimbabwe themselves, if they had a free, fair, and credible election, would want to remove it. But the ANC is saying, no, there will be no regime change. And yet at the same time, when people try to escape the economic and political hardships in Zimbabwe, ANC will see to it that you are not coming to South Africa. This is something that is completely and totally unacceptable. As much as South Africa and South Africans have got the right to decide who goes to their country and stays there, I think it is totally unacceptable that South Africa is now putting itself in a position where it's saying to another country, to Zimbabwe, we'll tell you who must govern Zimbabwe. And if you find life tough there, you cannot come to South Africa. That is totally unacceptable. That is something that is totally unacceptable. ANC, what ANC is doing here is totally unacceptable. ANC is the one, yes, is the dominant, South Africa is the dominant country in the Sadak region. And the ANC is going to pull rank in Sadak to try to get everybody else in Sadak to water down the Sadak report on the 23rd August 2023 Zimbabwean election. That Sadak report made it very clear that the process itself was so flawed, it could not possibly produce a legitimate government. And now ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa is bending over backwards and telling us that that statement is only challenges. And all other countries have got the similar challenges. These are challenges, institutionalized challenges, country-wide challenges. And to brush them under the carpet is completely unacceptable. I think South Africa should stop using other countries as pawns in its own political game. And in South Africa's attempt to turn Sadak and the AU reports, water them down for the sake of keeping Zanu PF in power, is totally unacceptable. And I think Zimbabweans really need to wake up now and step up the campaign that those elections were not free, fair, and credible. It's most unfortunate that our opposition were so corrupt and incompetent that the few who won the few seats that Zanu PF has always given away to entice the opposition to participate, to give the process legitimacy, could not resist accepting those gravitrans seats. That has only helped to strengthen those members in Sadak, like ANC, hand. They can now turn around. Those were challenges. Look, even the opposition accepted the results. Sadak should be honest. We have always had challenges with Zimbabwe's opposition. Sadak were the ones who proposed the 2008 to 2013 government of national unity. And Sadak were the ones who literally nagged Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends throughout the 5 years of the GNU to implement the democratic reforms. Sadak as a body called a special summit in June 2013, proposing that that year's election should be postponed until reforms are implemented. Because they realized that without reforms, Zimbabwean elections will never be free, fair, and credible. All the country's institutions have been captured. But when the opposition ignored their recommendations, Sadak threw in the towel and have been rubber stamping rigged elections ever since. This year was different. This year they said no, these institutional flaws and irregularities cannot be ignored anymore. But now we have got South Africa that is determined they are ignored again. Zimbabwe is a failed state. Zimbabwe is not going to get out of this mess until we can implement the democratic reforms and give ourselves a chance of holding free, fair, and credible elections. The Sadak report and the AU report on these elections were giving Zimbabwe another chance of that. We are now seeing South Africa snatching away that chance. South Africa is determined to water down those reports purely for the sake of keeping Zanu PF in power and stopping regime change in Zimbabwe. I would like to say it again. It is not for South Africa to decide whether there is regime change in Zimbabwe or not. It is for the people of Zimbabwe to decide that in a free, fair, and credible election. These elections were not free, fair, and credible. SADC have said so. The AU have said so. All the other nations and institutions with any democratic credibility have said so. And yet here we are. South Africa is poking its big nose into our business and telling us those elections were free, fair, and credible. This is an outrage. If we let South Africa get away with this one, we will have to endure the next 5 years of this Zanu PF dictatorship, with all the consequences that we are all too familiar with. South Africa must not be allowed to water down the Sadak report, the AU report, condemning Zimbabwe's 2023 elections. That message must be sent and must be repeated loudly and very clearly. This is totally, totally unacceptable. Thank you and good night.